he's seeing a patient in urgent care clinic who had what was clearly kind of a viral upper respiratory infection. But he tested him for strep, even though he didn't think it was. And the patient really wanted antibiotics. And when he left the room and then came back, the patient said, was fighting him, but said, I put it into ChatGPT and it agreed with you. And so I'm okay not getting antibiotics. This is, the kind of this automation bias where people feel like things that come out of machines sometimes are somehow more reliable than the individual or the human in front of them. And I saw a survey a couple months ago that something like 20% of people in the U.S. had received medical advice from an AI that they ultimately turned out to be wrong.
Welcome to How I Doctor, where we're bringing joy back to medicine. Today, I'm joined by Dhruv Khullar, a hospitalist at New York Presbyterian, a health policy researcher at Weill Cornell, and a contributing writer to The New Yorker, where he has spent the last several years writing some of the most clear-eyed, unsettling, and I think ultimately hopeful pieces about what medicine is becoming. Dhruv is not just somebody who writes about medicine from the outside. He still sees patients. He rounds on the hospital service. And when he goes home and sits down to write, he's writing as somebody who was just in the room an hour ago. I think that dual life, the clinician and the journalist, the person asking the questions and is still the person who has to give the answers, gives him a really unique perspective at this moment in time. What I want to know from Dhruv is actually, what is he doing differently at the bedside? Because if the person writing about cognitive de-skilling is himself wondering whether AI is changing how he thinks about a case, then that's the conversation we probably need to have. I'll be back after a quick word from our sponsors. Before we jump into the episode, I want to thank our sponsor, Evidently. Evidently is the clinical data intelligence platform built to help physicians harness the ocean of patient data they're drowning in every day. From chart summarization to AI-assisted note drafting and denial appeal support, Evidently makes sure the right data shows up at the right time. Physicians using Evidently report spending less time hunting through charts and more time focusing on patient care. That's why they've become a trusted partner to health systems looking to improve documentation, quality, and revenue sustainability. The company is led by providers and AI researchers that are dedicated to reducing documentation burden and helping clinicians practice at the top of their license. If you want to see what Evidently can do for your hospital or your practice, reach out today at www.evidently.com. Now, let's get into today's episode. Okay, Dr. Dhruv Khullar, welcome to How I Doctor.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited for it.
I'm really curious what you decide to write about.
There's a lot of different ways that I come to a piece. I think the most interesting way is often something that I have experienced myself in my clinical practice. So that might be something that I interact with patients that they're asking about, or I'm working with a medical student or a resident. And that's often where some of the richest and most interesting ideas come from, because they are in some ways the most real. They're tangible. They're things that people are confronting on a day-to-day basis. I think the second big area really is following an area of research. These days, there's a lot of research on the ways in which AI is or is not changing medicine, but that's true of many different aspects of healthcare. And so I'm often looking at prominent journals, seeing if there's an area of the literature that's starting to mature, or something that we thought was true is no longer true. And that's another big source of ideas. And I think the third is just current events. I mean, healthcare, in a surprise to no one, is one of the most important areas of policy and politics, and it has been for decades now. It's also true that a lot of social policy and a lot of economic policy has downstream consequences for the practice of medicine. I often think that a lot of what happens culturally and societally ends up, as you know, in the emergency room or in the hospital. And so all these external forces are really putting pressure on the practice of medicine as well.
You are so good at going deep on stuff that I don't think I probably have the attention span for, honestly. But that's like the difference between an ED doc and a hospitalist as well.
Versus I am. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like you are able to interview people and think really deeply about things, but still write about things that seem very pressing and very current. Like, how are you able to go so deep, but also focus on things that are current events at the same time.
Well, one of the real advantages I have writing for the New Yorker is I get the gift of time. So I, can often spend months researching an article, whether it's about GLP-1s or peptides or AI and making diagnoses. And the second is the gift of space. And so, in the past, a lot of the writing that I was doing was kind of column or op-ed writing. So that might be 800 words or 1,000 words. And that's not to discount what you can do, in that space, but it's certainly not kind of deep reported journalism in the way that you can do over 5,000 or 6,000 words and see one issue from many different angles. And then the last thing that I'll just say is that the editors are incredible at the New Yorker and the kind of the entire New Yorker machine. Often that type of dialogue with other people in the institution always takes an idea that I might have and transforms it into something that is really at a higher level that I could do by myself.
I'm curious how much you apply your medical training, whether you're actively trying to or not, to writing a story. Are you able to come at your ideas really with just pure curiosity and objectivity, and you're just like, I don't know what I'm going to find? Or do you have a kind of an angle that you think about when you're writing the piece, and maybe that angle changes as you discover more information, just like we do with patients?
It's a little bit of both. Just like in medicine, sometimes you know the diagnosis right away, and sometimes it really takes a lot of time. And the more you learn, the more you shift the way you're thinking about a patient. And so, I'll give you an example. I went into a piece recently about GLP-1 medications like semaglutide and tirzepatide, and trying to understand whether they might be helpful not just for obesity and diabetes, things that people associate them with, but for addiction. And I entered that experience with quite an open mind, and over the course of the reporting became more and more convinced that these medications were psychoactive medications, that they were helping people. At first, it seemed in an anecdotal way, and then observational studies came out, and now there are randomized controlled trials that show that, for instance, for people struggling with alcohol use disorder, these medications may be able to moderate their drinking. Now, I did a piece right after that was focused on other types of peptides, not GLP-1s, glucagon-like peptides, but many unapproved peptides. And I went into that pretty skeptical that these peptides that have not, in some cases, received any human study and certainly don't have the types of controlled trials that we expect of medications.
Yeah.
And people were injecting them in themselves, and some, physicians were even prescribing them through compounding pharmacies and other ways. I entered that pretty skeptical, and I, ended up in also a skeptical place. So
Yeah.
sometimes you kind of know what you're getting into, and sometimes you have a much more kind of open mind as you're entering a new piece of reporting.
I think you're so good at highlighting the tensions we are seeing in modern society, and then it's like through the lens of medicine, right? The idea of peptides and GLP-1s having tremendous impacts on society, and should they be everywhere? And then you go to the other side of totally unregulated gray market from China peptides, and where should the line be in terms of regulation, patient choice, cost, all of these really important factors that often don't get discussed in the policy room or in Congress, but you're able to bring these questions up, and so people are starting to think about them. I think you're doing a really important and valuable service for society and also for the profession of medicine. I think that is often missing from kind of the soundbite world and the TikTok world approach of, oh, I have to get my point across in 15 seconds.
Yeah, I think we are in this world right now, and this is one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot and wrote about recently. Just the way that doctors are going to be public actors or are public actors today is very different than it was several decades ago. And so, many of the kind of things that doctors and the medical profession had monopolies on in the 20th century, let's say medical information, no longer because of first Google and now AI, obviously, access to medical care. You had to go to a doctor in the past, and now maybe you don't. Maybe you can go through a direct-to-consumer company, or you can order something online. And then, importantly, medical authority. Doctors were the ones who were determining what type of diseases people had, how to diagnose those things, what the right things to do was. But the world that we're in is just very different than it was before. And the doctor's orders are no longer going to be sufficient. People aren't, going to take mandates and orders in the way that maybe they did in the past. And for that reason, I think the doctor's perspective or rationale or persuasion, all these types of things are much more important today than in the past because we are in a much more competitive landscape in terms of authority. And people want to be persuaded and convinced in a way that maybe they didn't in the past. And so part of what I'm trying to do, and I think many others are trying to do, is figure out, what are the ways to stay true to the evidence, but also make things engaging and entertaining so that people have the right information to make decisions with.
Dhruv, I promise to not fully spend the rest of the time on AI, but you've thought about it deeply. I love to think and talk about it. In your recent piece, you talked about cognitive de-skilling as being the central risk, and can you just define that for listeners?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of cognitive de-skilling is that if you offload difficult cognitive tasks, critical thinking, reasoning to machines, you are going to become less good at those things, independent of relying on an AI. And I'll just add to that, there's also a risk of cognitive foreclosure. So de-skilling implies you had the skill and you lost it. Foreclosure means you never developed the skill in the first place. And I am also concerned that there may be certain types of skills that medical trainees don't end up learning because of an over-reliance on AI. Now, look, we've always had technology that's taken over parts of the doctor's job. I heard something recently that you should try to offload things that are boring, not things that are hard, to AI. And I think there's a lot of truth in that.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's a rote routine, billing, coding, documentation, these types of things, I think great. Let's offload it. We should be much more cautious when we're offloading difficult things. I spoke to a medical student a couple months ago who said basically every time he stepped outside of a patient's room, he put all their symptoms and their labs into an AI and it generated a differential for him. And he was so smart about it because he recognized this and he really started to feel uncomfortable that he wasn't doing that type of difficult cognitive work and then kind of made himself go through the differential himself before he turned to AI. So I think that was really smart. But this is it is so easy to turn to AI now, and so I think people just be very cognizant of when they're doing it.
A quick word about today's sponsor, Evidently. Their platform turns an ocean of fragmented clinical data into concise, actionable insights, chart summaries, note drafting, denial appeal support, HCC capture, so you spend time caring, not chasing. A transplant surgeon at a large academic medical center recently took transplant referral review from 2 hours to 20 minutes with AI-assisted chart review from Evidently. Physicians deserve workflows that improve accuracy, reduce exhausting chart biopsy, and help us practice at the top of our license. If you want to see how this might work in your hospital or your department, go to evidently.com. That's evidently.com to get started today. I think there's ways that we can integrate AI even into education as long as we are still thinking critically about its output. A med student could generate a differential with AI, and you could say, okay, well, what fact would make this differential wrong or inverted, or what would make you change your mind, kind of, as a way to force the med student or the resident to question things and generate their own critical thinking skills as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's exactly the right way to go about it. And, probing for understanding, for a comprehensive assessment. I tend to be pretty optimistic, and I think that there will ultimately be a strong integration of AI into clinical practice in a way that enhances what doctors can do and the care that patients get. But I think there will be some growing pains along the way.
I'm curious your thoughts on a topic that I don't know that you've talked about much, just the sycophancy of these models, especially the foundational models that tend to say, oh, you're right. Oh, what a great perspective. I guess my worry is that is not what you necessarily want for a medical chatbot at all. I wonder if you've thought much about how this actually affects the cognition of anybody in the medical space, or almost like our own confidence in ourselves too.
One thing that it brings to mind for me is so there's the side of it where the AI itself is being sycophantic, and you should be aware of that. But the other side of it is that we need to learn how to appropriately prompt AIs, and there's a lot of art in doing that. And one of the lessons of my reporting, as I've been thinking about patients using AI and doctors using AI, is the information that you put into the AI and how you ask the question can radically change the output and the ultimate diagnosis. And what I would advise for doctors or patients is to just go the extra step. And if it's being sycophantic or agreeing, have it explicitly point out areas where your reasoning might not be correct, or give counter arguments, and even opening up that space with the chatbot to get a different set of answers or nudge it in a different direction can be really important.
I had a patient in the ER a while ago who I think the urgent care had him use an enema because he was really constipated. And ChatGPT had convinced him that the enema, which was like a Fleet's phosphate, whatever, that he was hyperphosphatemic and was going to die from one enema. And I could not convince him otherwise. I checked the phosphorus level, totally normal. And even still, he continued to believe ChatGPT over literally the doctor that has literally malpractice risk if I'm wrong. And so that was just a fascinating idea. Why does he trust ChatGPT over me? Maybe I'm a stranger. Maybe he's interacted with ChatGPT so much and it is so often correct that it's more likely to him that the doctor is incorrect. Like, it was just a fascinating sense of, like, back to your point about authority. Like, I was like, I feel like I have no medical authority with this guy.
This is going to become an increasingly large challenge. I think I was talking to a colleague who had a similar experience, except in a slightly different way. In that, he's seeing a patient in urgent care clinic who had what was clearly kind of a viral upper respiratory infection, but he tested him for strep, even though he didn't think it was. And the patient really wanted antibiotics. And when he left the room and then came back, the patient said, was fighting him, but said, "Oh, I put it into ChatGPT and it agreed with you, and so I'm okay not getting antibiotics." And so this is, the kind of this automation bias where people feel like things that come out of machines sometimes are somehow more reliable than the individual or the human in front of them. And I saw a survey a couple months ago that something like 20% of people in the U.S. had received medical advice from an AI that they ultimately turned out to be wrong. And so people should just be aware of the risks and the benefits of using these things. Of course, AI is always available, and we have really substantial challenges with workforce shortages, primary care shortages. Something like half of U.S. counties don't have a single psychiatrist, so you can understand why people
Totally, yeah.
turn to these models, but they're certainly not infallible, and they're, I don't think, a replacement for good clinical care.
In your AI article, you wrote about is it Cabot?
Cabot, yeah.
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 So you wrote about this system called Cabot that goes up against literally some of the best diagnosticians in the world. And you said it flipped the question from can AI replicate physician cognition to how could it not? I'm curious if you can describe that moment a little bit.
I'm not someone who's been, an AI booster in some way. I mean, I'm open to the idea that it's going to have some really powerful effects in healthcare. But, I went to this with a very open mind. And Cabot is this model that was developed at Harvard. It was trained on an open AI model, but they customized it. And it's called Cabot because it's named after this famous physician named Richard Cabot, who was at the MGH about a century ago. And he came up with the CPCs, or the Clinical Pathological Conferences.
Okay. Yeah.
That may some listeners may know are published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and they're kind of the most interesting cases from the Massachusetts General Hospital, and they're published, and they're these conferences where a expert clinician is presented with a case, usually from residents and other trainees, and he or she reasons through the case in real time, and really is demonstrating what the gold standard of clinical diagnostic reasoning looks like. And at the end, there's a pathological diagnosis, and so whether or not they got the answer correct. So these are some of the hardest cases that we have, and many, I think, physicians would not necessarily get the right answer on most CPC cases. So they had this face-off, really, between actually one of my residency classmates who's probably the best resident in my class, and he's just such a diagnostic wizard. And he went through this really complex case and put together a presentation. He had weeks to do it, and he presented, and he had nailing the answer. And then they did the same thing with this bot, Cabot. And not only did it come up with the right answer, it developed a PowerPoint presentation that was 5 minutes long. It spoke in kind of the cadence and the professional tone that you would expect from, a master
An
diagnostician.
esteemed, yeah,
Yeah, exactly. It was kind of funny, and it threw in some jokes, and it also nailed the diagnosis. And I just sat there and almost gasped. I mean, it was one of those things where this is some of the most challenging, complex cognitive work that doctors do, and it was able to replicate what would take, a doctor hours or weeks to do in the matter of minutes. Now, I want to emphasize that this doesn't mean that it replaces diagnostic reasoning. In fact, again, these CPCs are curated in a way to allow for these types of diagnoses, and the bot was trained on all the CPCs in history, and so it was very good at this type of thing.
That nuance is critical. I mean, that's what the headlines of, AI is better than doctors always drives me a little bonkers because it's the judgment, it's the ability, it's the restraint, it's the ability to say, oh, the patient mentioned some weakness in their arm 3 weeks ago. I'm going to ignore that. I'm actively choosing to not focus on that because I don't think it's relevant to today. Today, I think the relevant thing is their fever, whatever it is. And if you just give the verbatim what the patient said, I would be surprised if a generative AI model could get anywhere with a lot of patients because so much of it is clinical judgment about which direction we're going to go, and me a little bit sometimes actively disagreeing or yelling at the patient and being like, no, we're not talking about your teeth. We really have to focus on the fact that you said you can't see in your right eye for the past 2 hours, whatever.
And this gets back a little bit to the sycophancy point, is guiding the patient in the right direction, asking the right
Yes.
questions, getting them to, maybe feel comfortable sharing things that they might not necessarily want to share.
Dhruv, let's talk about a little about the Gilded Age of Medicine. You wrote, I think, dazzling innovation on the surface, structural rot underneath. What do you think exemplifies that?
That piece was in kind of response to a growing sense among many clinicians, patients, the general public, that something is seriously wrong with healthcare, and that the pursuit of profit. It's not that the business of medicine was non-existent in the past. Not that doctors or hospitals ever cared about money, but it just seems like it is increasingly front and center. One growing trend over the past decade is the increasing acquisition of physician practices and hospitals by private equity firms. Private equity firms now own, I think, something around 500 hospitals in the United States. There are some markets in the United States where a single private equity firm owns more than half of physician practices in a single specialty. You can
Wow.
imagine the types of market distorting effects that has. But it's not just private equity firms. I mean, there are nonprofit hospitals that behave as if they are for-profit entities focused on generating as much profit as possible. I think another huge area that this has come to the fore is with Medicare Advantage.
Thank you. Totally.
One of the ways in which Medicare Advantage insurers are paid is based on the risk of their patients, how clinically, medically complex they are, and so there has become a growing game among some insurers to try to make their patients look as sick as possible, which involves capturing as many diagnostic codes as they can, even if those diagnoses don't have substantial bearing on the care for the patient. They might not even know that they have this diagnosis. No doctor might even treat that diagnosis, but because it is marked down in their chart in some way, that can net more money. And it will always be easier to make a patient look healthier or sicker on paper than to improve the quality of care, because that's hard to do in the real world. And so these are the types of games that I think people are responding to when they feel that medicine is now a business.
I was a health policy major in undergrad, and I remember hearing about Obamacare and that they were going to risk adjust and thinking, I remember being so excited by it. Like, oh, finally, somebody gets the fact that this patient who is 85-year-old and with 30 comorbidities is so much harder for me to manage than the 85-year-old who has no medical problems and is cycling every day. And, little innocent me had no idea that the powerful systems that be are able to corrupt that and gamify it and kind of turn it on its head.
I have a very similar experience. I was, in medical school when the ACA was passed, and was extremely excited about value-based care,
Yeah,
and thought
totally. Yeah.
that this was the way that you could break the iron triangle of healthcare. You could, improve access, you could control costs, you could improve quality, all at the same time. And there were a lot of people that pushed that narrative. And look. Do I think that value-based payment is an advance over fee-for-service payment? Yes, probably. I think we should be paying for the outcomes and the quality in a way that goes beyond simply delivering a service. If your patient goes home and dies the next day or has a great life, you get to pay the same amount. That's not right either. But I think I totally underestimated the extent to which there are unintended consequences for this type of payment. Part of that is, as you say, it can become a game of risk adjustment. But part of it is that the measures that are being incentivized are not always the most important measures. They may be measures that are easier to access, but not necessarily give you the complete picture of
Yeah.
what's happening with a
Measures you can
patient.
measure are not
Exactly.
necessarily the ones that matter. Yeah.
Exactly. Um, and so in all these ways, my own view is that the value-based care revolution has not delivered on its promise. Maybe there are some pockets of advance. I think the ACO model has been a good one. I think, things like CPC Plus, where you're paying for, um, care management in ways that, weren't previously reimbursed, accountable health communities where you're connecting patients with social needs to, community organizations and so on. So there are pockets in which things have really been, I think, a positive change. But as a whole, I think I underestimated the unintended consequences of this type of payment regime.
Do you have a sense that the fundamental problem in American healthcare is profit motive at all, or is it just that profit motive has become, so perversely emphasized?
It's okay to have some profit motive. In fact, that might inspire some types of healthy competition. And so I'm not
Totally.
against the profit
Yeah.
motive at all. And I think there are some ways in which medicine can and should be a business. I think we should have a greater emphasis on customer satisfaction or patient satisfaction. It is a scandal that people have to take a half a day or a day off work to see their primary care doctor for 15 minutes. I mean, this type of convenience, I think, is beaten out of other industries because you lose the customer.
Yeah.
I think there are some areas, intellectual property, I think, is really important. I mean, in the past, the pharmaceutical sector was not what it is today. And there are certainly challenges with the pharmaceutical sector, but before they were able to commercialize, discoveries that were being made at academic medical centers, there were a lot of molecules that were sitting on the shelf. I think there are some management strategies and leadership strategies that healthcare can and is borrowing from other parts of the economy that are really healthy. But all that being said, I do think the pendulum has swung too far, and I think there there's increasingly a game to be played around extracting profit in all sorts of ways that don't benefit the patient. So we've talked about risk adjustment. I think that's a big part of it. I think consolidation is now a big part of it as you have these behemoth health systems that can distort markets in a way that increase prices. That can
Yeah.
be really challenging. There are things about the site of care. Simply doing the same procedure in one place versus another place
Hospital outpatient departments. Yeah. Yeah.
could result in a much higher payment. And so a lot of these games are being played, and they are not, I think, in service of providing patients with high quality, compassionate care. It is kind of bonkers that you don't know what you're going to pay.
Yeah.
You have no idea what the
No,
bill is going to be
yeah.
at the end of it, right? And you might have an estimate, you might have a general sense, sometimes there's a copay. But if something actually happens in a clinical encounter or you need some type of care, you have no idea how much you're going to pay. And that is true if you're a doctor or a health economist, much less if you're a patient who doesn't have expertise in the healthcare space. And so, um, you know, that obviously is going to steer people away from the healthcare system, and some of that is totally understandable.
Where do you think physicians end up in, say, 5, 10 years? What's different about our work? What is still the same?
In 5 or 10 years, there's going to be a lot more routine tasks and transactional care that is largely automated or that has much less human involvement. By that, you already see things like Doctronics pilot in Utah, where refills are being automatically dispensed or prescribed. Currently with some human oversight, but I think the idea is that you wouldn't need a doctor in the loop for that type of thing. I have a hard time seeing how, if that goes well and other similar pilots go well, a lot of transactional care. I just need an X-ray for a sprained ankle. I need a antibiotic for a UTI. These types of things will be largely automated, and a lot more of the doctor's work will be on complex cases, managing medical conditions that conflict with one another. You have to diurese someone for their heart failure, but it's going to hurt their kidneys. Things like managing uncertainty, eliciting people's values. And I think the question of responsibility and liability is going to be a very interesting one. I think people still want, at the end of the day, someone to quarterback their care. They want someone to take responsibility for challenging decisions. You can envision some of that being offloaded to AIs that assume liability and the company assumes liability. But I think for the most part, people and doctors are still going to be the ones that are doing that type of work. I think more doctors will have a public oriented presence. I think we've talked about the power of storytelling and communication and narrative and persuasion. I think these types of things will become more important as things like basic medical knowledge, even access, are easier to come by. People will still want experts to guide them through some of the thornier and more challenging, more uncertain decisions that they have to make.
I kind of like a version of physicians keeping our relevance and position in society by kind of aligning with patients and saying, like, look, we don't think this is a great system either. We want to change this too. And like the physician patient relationship, we know is the fundamental core of what so much of medicine is trying to accomplish. Like, could physicians really maintain our place by saying, hey, we want to be the most pro-patient, supporting the people who need care, people that exist? I don't think traditionally the AMA or medicine has gone in that direction, but I think it's like potentially like a survival marketing play.
I think that's so right. And I think that has to be the foundation for doctor advocacy. I mean, I think a lot of historically it's been focused on, maintaining certain levels of reimbursement and payment and maybe scope of practice. I think those things are not unimportant, but I think the most successful version of doctors advocating for a better healthcare system will be in conjunction with patients and will be focused on the needs of patients. I spoke not too long ago with a physician I really respect, and he said, "Why should the average person care about whether doctors have a privileged position? What they care about is who is going to help me when I need help." And that's true. I mean, the extent that doctors deserve or should have some type of special status in society, it should be because their work is in service of helping people live meaningful and healthy lives. And I think if we turn our back on that, or if we even push that to the side, it's going to be much harder to make the argument that people should listen to us or that we should have an outsized role in society.
Okay, well, I've got one more tension just because you brought it up in my head. Is medicine a job or a calling?
I would separate whether it should be a job or a calling or whether it is. I
Yeah,
think that it's increasingly has become a job. And I
yeah.
think for many people, they see it that way. And often with good reason. I mean, most doctors now employed, they are not running their own shops. They are often treated like any other employee, and it's not surprising that people have more of a shift work mentality than they did in the past. I think the best version of medicine is something closer to a calling, where we recognize that, of course, there are trade-offs with personal life and professional life, and what you're going to, sacrifice in terms of your own, well-being to care for others. But um, medicine is at its best when it's guided by a professional ethos that that demand something more than any other kind of commercial profession would. We have an obligation to care for people. I think, regardless of their background or their ability to pay, or their clinical condition. And I think if we totally give up on that and we think of medicine like any other business, we're really losing something special about what it means to practice medicine.
I think you and I are very aligned. I was arguing with Congressman Dr. Greg Murphy is a urologist, and he thinks it's fundamentally is just a calling. It's not a job at all, and that fundamentally the problem with med students these days, the kids these days, is that they don't believe it's a calling, and that they need to have more intrinsic motivation, and that that it's a privilege and an honor to get to take care of patients. And I fully agree with him. I just think it's hard to motivate people by saying, "Well, you should feel differently about this work." I think if the work were to be different, if the system were to change, I think we could move back toward the calling side of medicine. But it's really the job part is a response to the lack of autonomy, the challenges and the stressors of trying to deliver care with so many restrictions and limits on what we can do anymore. Dr. Dhruv Khullar, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to get to talk with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
Thanks for joining me today. For interviews with physicians creating meaningful change, check out offcall.com/podcast. You can find How I Doctor on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll have new episodes weekly. This has been and continues to be Dr. Graham Walker. Stay well, stay inspired, and practice with purpose.